Today on the Life Science Success Podcast, it's my pleasure to welcome Jacob Glanville. Welcome, Jake.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm the son of innkeepers from Guatemala. My parents had a hotel and a restaurant down there, and I grew up with them. And I think that's where I got my background in entrepreneurial business development. They built a business in the middle of a civil war down there, and then not just my parents, but all the people in the Zutuwil Mayan community where I grew up. Most people also have small micro businesses. This could be like opening up a window on the front of their house that faces the street and selling treats or candies or firecrackers through it in various ways. I think that's a useful market of entrepreneurs and creative business solving, and then also just it's a negotiation culture. So that was my early background. I was always interested in immunogenetics. So when I got to the States, at UC Berkeley, I was working on genetics, genomics, and development, and combining computational science and statistics to analyze large data sets around the immune system. And that's always been a really interesting area for me personally. I have asthma, and I've had family members with autoimmune disease. I also think it sort of sits at the beating heart of a lot of medicine. So your immune system is an engine of war designed to detect abnormalities of tissues and respond. And that means that almost all disease areas have some level of involvement in the immune system, even like heart disease and neurodegenerative disorders, and certainly infections in the pandemic. So I felt that learning things there would teach me many other things about the larger universe of medicine. And computational methods, I just find them cool. I've always been fascinated by math and computers and biostatistics. And it turns out that that's really helpful to use to analyze the immune system, because the immune system is a heavily combinatoric set of processes. Fundamentally, what your body has to do is it has to fight for the forever war since the beginning of time. We have to fight off pathogens that can divide and mutate every 30 minutes, where our cycle of mutation and change is like every 15 years in modern times later. So you can have children. So how do you fight these things off if they fizz away and mutate so quickly? And the way we do that is that we have cells like T cells and B cells and cytokines that have these combinatorial systems of shuffling and evolving at the same pace as our enemies to keep them away from us. And that's a great system, but that also means it's super tough to analyze. And that's the value of high throughput sequencing and high throughput synthesis and these other complex technologies, is it really let us crack open the hood and look at the engine and understand how that system worked. And the reason that that's valuable is that if you understand how that works, you can begin to improve it. We can improve our vaccines to produce broad spectrum responses against viruses that mutate quickly. We can understand why an autoimmune patient's immune system has faltered, or we can improve the practical aspects of discovering antibody drugs that they hit all the versions of the coronavirus and don't become obsolete. So that was my work there.
Yeah.
I mean, I can go on. I did work at Stanford, and then I became an entrepreneur with Distributed Bio that I founded in 2012, recently sold it, and now I've launched Centivax more recently.
So you were at Pfizer though first, right? Is that correct? Did I read that correct?
That's right. I was at Pfizer after Berkeley, I was at Pfizer from 2008 to 2012. And when I was there, I was lucky. I got brought into a group called Renat that was using antibodies as drugs. And so they were using the immune system to generate medicine, like your own body does. Your body is a drug generation engine, the envy of the entire pharmaceutical industry, because you can stub your toe, and within a couple of weeks, you're producing antibodies against whatever infection you got there. Whereas the drug industry typically takes 10 years to do that same process. So the industry has been looking increasingly into saying, how do we harness the power of these natural systems? And that's what was happening at Pfizer. And that's where I developed methods to use deep sequencing and other tools to try to really understand what was going on and speed up that process of discovering the right antibodies and be able to do it faster and engineer them to make better medicines.
Yeah. And so, I mean, if I and I'm not a scientist, so I mean, I kind of frame that up, right? So that I don't have your background and things like that. So if I understand though, the way that mRNA vaccines work, or the way that, CAR T therapy works and things like that, it's kind of the same way that you're describing, some of your work at early work at Pfizer. Is that correct?
Yeah. What they have in common is the immune system, right? The centerpiece here, right? With a vaccine, you give the immune system little pieces of the virus, and your own body makes the drug. You are mounting a challenge against the pieces that you got injected with of the pathogen, so that your own body is now chock full of good antibodies to protect you when the pathogen shows up. Mm-hmm. And then for CAR T, again, you want to harness the immune system. So what they're doing is they are now genetically engineering a set of your T cells, part of your immune system, these white blood cells, so that they're arming them with information to be able to go specifically attack a cancer tissue. And so they're just giving, in both cases, you're giving the immune system a boost to help guide it towards a problem that it's for some reason not able to address in time or appropriately.
Yeah. So then you move from there to distributed bio, and what made you want to create the company? What made you want to start there?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, in 2012, I against the advice of some friends of mine who were like, Jake, you have a BA and you're a principal scientist at Pfizer. Like you got lucky, hold it out. But I left because I didn't think they were going to promote me 5 times. I thought, I was capping out. And also I didn't have kids yet. And I had this cool idea and I was like, this is the time for me to go do this. So I hedged my bets a little bit. I applied for the Stanford PhD program in computational systems immunology. And I also founded the company. And that way I figured one of the two could not work out and I'd be okay. And they both did. So I just didn't sleep a lot for 5 years. But the ideas I had were, for the PhD, I wanted to surround myself with really smart people who could kick holes in ideas that I had, just in case I was wrong, so I didn't waste my life working on something that was fundamentally flawed. And I knew immunology. I needed to surround myself with smarter people who knew things that were never written down in a textbook, but they had that institutional knowledge. I learned that from my grandfather, who worked in rocket science at NASA, and he was always complaining. He's like, a lot of this stuff isn't written down. As these people die, we're losing institutional knowledge. And that's the truth and the power of working around remarkable people. Is there's this active flow of living knowledge, and you need to be in that stream or you become obsolete or naive. And I wanted to do that. And then in the industry side, the big idea was, when I was at Pfizer, I was using these genomic sequencing technologies. There was an arms race to make the bigger, faster, quicker genome, right? And this had distilled down the whole Human Genome Project, which was a decade-long exercise, down to this box that could live in your lab, and you can go swab your mouth and run, I'm simplifying it a little bit, but really it pops your genome out. It's magical, right? And so I was like, okay, well, genome's done, been there, done that, 26,000 genes, whoop-dee. But what was really interesting to me was the immune system, which has billions of variants in it. And I pointed that technology at the immune system. And it gave me, when I saw the data, I started realizing why the immune system was failing sometimes. And it gave me ideas on how to make it work better. One of those was a universal vaccine, or I prefer to call it a broad spectrum vaccine, that to be able to overcome things like influenza, maybe even HIV and other rapidly mutating pathogens. And then I also had some ideas on how to engineer antibodies better and faster using those genomic sequencers. And there's also been this revolution in DNA synthesis. And so I wanted to combine those two to make better drugs. And so I jumped ship, launched distributed bio. I had this crazy idea, which we wrote down in a napkin, which actually has worked out, where I was like, I think there's this magical opportunity to build a biotech without ever taking venture capital. And the idea was, first, we would provide, the first vertical of the business would be providing the software technology. So I had built these algorithms to analyze the immune system, and I know a bunch of companies wanted them. They're trying to hire me. And I was like, we can build a company where we don't need to buy a bunch of computers, because the Amazon cloud just came online. So we can go rent the world's biggest supercomputer. And what they want to have access to, instead of hiring me, give me licensed access to a software platform that we cast up into the cloud so they could do what I was doing with genomic sequencing instruments applied to the immune system. And that's pretty good. But you have a finite number of clients. There's maybe like 400 biotechs and pharmaceuticals that would be your licensees. So it's never going to be like a Facebook where you have billions of people. But it's enough money and enough data to then do the second tier, which was, now that we have all this data, we've seen more antibodies than anybody else on the planet, we can learn from natural immune systems over how to make them better and faster. And so we built technologies in laboratory space, and then we serviced that out to a whole bunch of companies, and they would also be our paying clients. And then once we had the technologies and the data and the analysis, then we would start producing in-house, using the profits, our own portfolio of therapeutics. And so that largely is how things played out. And I built it forward. It was painful at times because I didn't have a big influx of cash up front, but that also forced us to produce technologies that worked, because we had clients that would walk away if the thing wasn't good. It's just like my parents. If they made a bad steak, that person would leave and tell other people, don't go to the restaurant. That's no good. So it forced us to make things that work the entire way. And I think that has contributed to our success of building a super strong foundation on that pyramid as we went forward towards therapeutics.
Yeah, and so in January, distributed bio gets bought, right? So I mean, there's a lot of other history, I'm sure, in there. But the one thing that I remember, I didn't know about you until your video, just kind of announcing what you were going to go do with Centivax, and so that was kind of my introduction to you, anyway. And so can you describe to people what you want to do differently with Centivax?
Yeah, sure. So Centivax was that was really that third tier of the idea that we cultivated inside of distributed bio, and it was always the plan to potentially spin that out. First off, what you said was absolutely correct. Like M&A, these acquisition transactions are these super long, multi-year, unbelievable headache process. And I've been in rooms where there's so many lawyers around the room. I'm sitting there being like, my God, we're going to spend $60,000 on this meeting today. But that's how acquisitions take place. And so the deal was, okay, we're going to sell off the services business and the software, but I'm going to spin out the therapeutics and the vaccines because I'd spent those years building them up. I had partnerships with the NIH and the Gates Foundation, the Navy and the Army, Nimble and US AMRID. It was ready to go and we matured them. So I was ready to spin this thing out and bring it forward. And the vision is as follows. So one is technological and the other one is societal transformative. So from the technology perspective, we've developed ways to make antibodies that are called broadly neutralizing, that they're able to bind the Achilles heel on viruses or like snake antivenom or certain cancer targets that otherwise mutate a lot, but we're able to pick these really selective sites and build the right response to overcome these problems. And that's a big deal because vaccines are fantastic. They're one of the greatest medical advances since sanitation and fire, but they've faltered against rapidly mutating pathogens. It's why we don't have a working flu shot that eradicates the problem. We don't have an HIV vaccine that really works at all. And we've never made a vaccine against like the common cold as an example.
Sure.
It's why the vaccines are becoming obsolete right now against the current coronavirus. So you can overcome this. It's just a technological step to create a second generation of vaccines that could continue to do what vaccines did successfully in the last century on eradicating some of our most ancient pathogen enemies. That's the power of vaccine technology. And I wanted to do that. We also have antibody technologies we can go produce that can, somebody else has done the work of proving that that's the right target. Sometimes it's obvious, like snake venom, the venom's the target. Sometimes there's a lot of research that went into say for staph infections, what are the good targets? But we've been able to build off of that. So they've done the work to find the target, which is a really hard problem. We're now using the golden age of biotechnology to engineer the better medicine to make that drug actually go the distance and solve the problem well. So that's the technology side. But there's a bigger goal here, and that is that fundamentally, I don't think we fully realized the power of biologic medicine. These are antibodies and other biologics that in order to really manifest their power, we need to have a way to transform manufacturing and to be able to reduce the cost of the medicine. So right now, the way these medicines are priced, the folks in my village I grew up in can't afford them. And in fact, a bunch of people in the United States can't really afford them either. So they're priced in a way that if you have good insurance in the first world, then you can pay for them. And that works okay for the companies because the manufacturing is such, you can't produce an infinite supply. So you're given a finite supply, they focus on the biggest market. But that's enough that's turning off even the Europeans don't want to pay for the cost of a bunch of these medicines. And we're having a problem in the United States of increasingly expensive medicines with increasing cost burden on our healthcare system. And so for all of those reasons, I was looking to what I see as an inevitable future of finding a way to make these medicines and adopting instead the Ford model of mass producing them at a lower cost so that there's a much greater access. And first off, that's better for the world and human health. I'll talk a little bit about my aspirational goals here, which I think are big, but and we'll see how far we get. But I think it's actually good business too, because there's this big peak of people who can pay a lot. But if you start lowering your price, you get access to the second peak of a lot more people who could pay less, but that the volume there is to your advantage. So you're doing a lot more good, but there's also an amazing first mover advantage to people who can manufacture medicine less expensively and distribute it more globally. So that's part of the objective. And the long-term objective, the dream is I want to participate in leveraging the golden age of biotechnology that we currently live in to help create a post-pathogen humanity for our children and our children's children. We actually have the tools disposable to us for the first time in history to be able to win the forever war against some of these ancient enemies that we have. And we should try to build those things in our time with our hands so that our children and our children's children think of things like influenza as this archaic thing like the plague that just doesn't affect them in society anymore. And I want to participate in building that because the time that they're not spending fixing their broken selves, the money and the resources and their time could be better put towards creating new and better things, which is what I love the most about people.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, the part that you say about, parts of the world just not having access to things, I've interviewed in the past different global leaders that have said the same thing that, look, the medicines that we come out with today in some parts of the world aren't going to be available for the next 5 to 10 years. So having people, like you working on those advancements are key.
And I think You know, there's kind of two parts to me. I think on one, and it's really like my mother and my father built into my head. Like my mother is a very like ethically thoughtful person. She's an artist, and I think I do believe those things, and I believe I can see a future and we can walk towards it. I see a path through technology to enable a healthier, safer world, and I think that's a worthy exercise to conduct in our lifetimes. But I also recognize that dreams themselves never manifest unless you have a tractable approach to reach there, and economics are part of that. So I think people think incorrectly about this. I think they were either taught it incorrectly in business school, or they just bad habits have been built up in biotechnology because of the status quo of yesterday's tech. So I think there actually is an opportunity to affect this that makes financial sense, and that is as follows. People say, well, there's neglected tropical diseases because no one will pay for it. First off, that's insulting. That's not true. Everyone in the world can pay for medicine. They just can't pay these ridiculous prices. And second, if you look at those prices are not predicated on the cost of goods of manufacture. The cost of goods of pills, small molecules, is super cheap. It's like less than $1 per pill. It's going to be a couple cents. For antibody therapeutics, currently it's over $100 per dose, but they charge like $8,000 per dose. So where the hell is the rest? Excuse my French, but where does the rest of that money come from? And I'll tell you, they don't do what my dad does when he's trying to figure out how much to charge a client for a steak, right? In a restaurant, we say, well, steak costs $8. We're hiring people and rent and all these things. So we're going to charge $22 and that covers everything. And we have a percent profit. That is not the way the drugs are calculated. What they calculate the price of a drug is they say, how painful is it for the insurance companies to have to cover someone who doesn't have my drug? So if it costs them $20,000 to take care of someone who doesn't have the medicine until they deteriorate, whereas if they had your drug and it worked half of the time and it saves suddenly 3/4 of that pain, you can run a little calculation to say, okay, we can charge $8,000 and that's still on average, the insurance companies will pay for it because it saves money, which is why this crazy scenario, you have two antibodies, they cost the same amount to produce. One's for cancer and one's for like an eye disorder called macular degeneration. The cancer drug will be $8,000 a dose. The macular degeneration drug will be $2,000 a dose.
Sure.
And so that there's a false dichotomy or a deliberate equivocation of the problem. And that is that if you can change the financial model, then you actually could make these medicines more affordable and largely accessible. The other requirement here is a technological shift, and that is that there is this finite ability to produce the medicines. We've heard about this all year with the coronavirus,
right?
Because of yesterday's technologies. And so if you could, that's a technology solution. If you could come up with new technologies to go produce much more doses of the drug, then suddenly you are alleviated from the requirement that you have a finite amount of, apples in your cart. And so you have to sell those apples. You need to make enough money to go home. If you have an infinite apple tree behind you, then you can choose to charge less per apple because you basically have the font of cash behind you. And so you can reduce that price, bring it closer to cost of goods, do a lot more good to the world, and frankly, become a very successful company. So I've surprised some people where I'm like, I want to be able to make these medicines cost less than an iPhone. And they're like, well, they normally cost $8,000. And I'm like, yeah, but you want to if you can scale manufacturing, that business model works. Like Apple has done okay. They're a decent business model. It's just the ability to make lots of doses is the thing in the way. And that's where there is a state change taking place. So the technologies we've been trapped in so far, there are a bunch of new technologies on the horizon, and I'm focusing on them, and I'm preparing my business for that transition where it becomes much easier to manufacture much larger doses of the medicine. And that's part of our mission is to work on those, either partner with them or develop them in-house so that we have those technologies. And that allows us to manifest that large-scale vision.
Yeah, I really look for, I mean, I just look forward to seeing companies, like Centivax or Distributed Bio having the ability to bring the velocity to some of these drugs, right? I mean, the cost to me is one thing, but also the speed that you can deliver versus, long R&D processes with lots of people. Big drug companies typically come with bigger, R&D processes right behind them. But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to wind up in a better place. It honestly might mean that you're just a bit more rigorous about certain things in your processes. So I do look forward to kind of the velocity of companies, like yours.
There's been a really cool change. So I've watched this kind of first from the inside at Pfizer. Where I watched the infrastructure that they built up to solve these problems. Then outside at Distributed Bio, we had over 60 companies we worked with to discover or optimize medicines across 78 programs. And some of these were, 7 of the top 10 pharma were my clients, but there were also a whole bunch of little biotechs. And I remember just being like fascinated by a number of them we're a group of like 12 people who are going to go run a clinical program. And that was like unheard of 15 years ago, where the whole industry, the idea was everything had to be so bespoke that the only people who could do this were like inside of the hallowed halls of a Pfizer or Genentech or Boehringer Ingelheim. Kind of like how NASA was the only really one who could go put together all the pieces to bespoke our ability to go up to the moon. That has changed. That has changed a lot. And the reason for it is that there's been a fractaling of all of the different functions that had to pipeline together to make a drug that previously were within these mega corporations. Now they all exist as contract research organizations. In fact, I was one of them. For discovery, instead of having to go to the department inside of your mega pharma, people would just come to me and say, okay, I'm going to be your discovery of the drug. Then they go to someone else to run safety and tox, and then someone else to go run manufacturing. Someone else manages their clinical study. In fact, that's what I'm doing at Centivax. So we were able to go from discovery, which we started at January 29th last year. We completed discovery of the molecule by the end of March. We characterized it by the summer, and we're into manufacturing. And we have partners at each step. And so Centivax formally separated after the acquisition at the beginning of this year, and we're going clinical June 1st. Like, that is a remarkable acceleration. And it's really good for everybody in this whole industry that lots of little companies can now go outsource the individual functions, because it means more medicines are going online. Those medicines are happening faster, and we're able to test more things, and more patients will ultimately benefit. And that is a really cool state change on the nature of drug discovery, because it's been distributed in a way that what you really need is a good idea and resources to go execute the steps.
Yeah, that's for sure. And so can you tell me a little bit about the Netflix show Pandemic? So I mean, it was kind of funny to me, because the timing that I found out about the episode was when, at least I live in Colorado, and when the epidemic was kind of hitting here, that was whenever I found out about the show. I don't know how much earlier it was on Netflix, but yeah. Knowing that you were on there, what was the timing of the show, and so what was the taping versus when COVID-19 for you?
So the taping happened in 2019. So they reached out to that's what I've been doing for years, is I focus on pandemic medicine, broad spectrum antibodies, broad spectrum vaccines. So they reached out to us back in 2019. They said, hey, we're doing this documentary series. We're wondering if we could include you as one of the storylines. And I thought it was a good idea. I have a general principle that I think we don't do a good enough job as scientists to open up our process. And as a consequence, you have conspiracy theorists and stuff. If you don't share information, people are going to assume the worst. And so I was like, let's just open the doors and let them watch. I'm proud of what we're doing. We have a strong team, and it's hard. And I wanted people to see that process, that it takes a lot of effort, and we struggle to go do it, but the people have good intentions. It's not a bunch of like scheming people hiding behind a boardroom going, oh, how do we mess everybody up with evil vaccines? Like, we're trying to make the right medicine, and I wanted people to see that. I had no idea how much of a time investment it was going to be. Yeah. For some reason, I thought it was going to be like, I don't know, a week of interviews or something. And instead, it was like 7 or 8 months. They went down to Guatemala with us twice for like a week. They're up here in our labs in California for 2 separate visits for a week. We were out in New York, and like they're there the whole time. You're like, I'm like brushing my teeth, and there's some dude in my face with a camera. Like that was that level of like integration into your life. But I'm glad we did it. It was also risky, because you're at they don't show you you don't get feedback on the edit. They just, like, when we found out what it looked like is when they released it on January 25th. And I remember Sarah Ives and the other folks that I was working with, they were all like, oh God, are they going to portray us well or not? Like, what if we don't get portrayed well? And I was like, you know what? I'm proud of what we do. Like, ultimately we're in the hands of fate on it. And I'm like, anyway, like, guys, just chill out. There's like 10,000 things on Netflix. No one's going to watch this. Like, don't worry about it. And instead, it comes out January 25th. And like, that's like within a day of when China goes and quarantines 57 million people because of the coronavirus. So we ended up on the front page of Netflix for like 6 weeks. And I woke up that morning at like, we had rented a little theater. My wife found this theater in San Francisco where you could rent the whole thing. So we had like a viewing party. And I woke up at like 4:15 in the morning or something, and my phone was just going bing, 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 freaking out. And I looked, and I had an insane number of messages, because the whole world was watching this thing and trying to contact us. And it was crazy.
Oh, that's excellent. And so, I mean, the first thing that I picked up in the series, right, is that you developed this pig lab in Guatemala. I work with both drug companies and medical device companies. And so, in that work, a lot of I mean, the most expensive things that we do in a lot of cases is having to study animals.
Yep.
So whenever I saw you, doing this, in a way, I thought, this is a nice, scrappy solution to a growing problem. But I guess what led you to developing the pig lab in Guatemala, and
Sure.
how did things outcome there?
Yeah. So, I mean, you've nailed it, right? At a high level with vaccine science, there's really not much between an idea and proof in an animal, right? It's a step function and it's a severe one. And I think that step function in the traditional ways that we fund things severely limits innovation in vaccine science. I think there's a limited number of people who are doing vaccine science because they're either funded for it because they're a big pharma, in which case they're pretty conservative, or they're small groups that need to have a bunch of resources to be able to go do those steps. And I think that just means that there's kind of groupthink and there aren't enough people doing the work and it moves surprisingly slowly. And so I had come up with this new idea for a broad spectrum vaccine to make a single flu shot that would protect against all flu. And I had to find a way to test it. I think my initial conversations when I came up with it, I was like, okay, sweet. Let's talk to some VCs and just tell them, hey, look, I just give me like $900,000 and then come back in a year and a half. And they're like, go away. Like, this is really different than everything we know. So it appears risky. You have no proof that it works and we don't know who you are. And so I'm very stubborn, and I was thinking my way through it. It's called the biotech valley of death. It's this space between some proof of concept where you could get more resources, and nobody wants to take responsibility for that high risk period. Or historically, that's been true. There's been some changes. And I wasn't a professor at a university to get a grant to be able to go do it. Even then, I would be risky to get a grant like that because you're sending it out to a bunch of people who are going to review it, and they may be like, "This is too new. This seems weird to me." And so there's a psychological barrier of very new ideas, which is unfortunate because it means less new things are tested. And so I was, I actually went. You know what happened? I remember I went to this meet the VC. One of my co-founders at GBI was like, "Here, let's go meet to these VCs." And so we were meeting this panel, and they were talking about what they're doing. And he bumps me on the shoulder. He's like, "Here, say some smart shit so they remember who you are." And so I was like, all right. So I'm like, "Hey, what do you guys do about the funding gap, the biotech valley of death?" And they were like, "Well, we don't think that that's real. We invested lots of areas." And I'm like, "Well, that's not really true. I've looked at your portfolios. You guys are all heavily leveraged later. You externalize that responsibility to public money in academia." And then this guy looks at me and he goes, one of the guys on stage goes, "I would never invest in someone who believes in a funding gap." And everybody in the room laughed at me. And I was just like, "Oh my God, this is so." And then my buddy was like, "Oh, I think you just learned a lot." And I'm like, "Dude, I'm going to kill you. Leave me alone. Are you kidding?" So I went home, and my lesson from that was to double down. So I was like, "Okay, I'm going to prove that guy wrong." And so I started thinking about it. I'm like, how am I going to get the in vivo data that I need to do this? And that's when I called a professor that I knew in Guatemala, and I called my father. And I started realizing, you know what, I could do this. I don't want to do it in mice. I want to do it in pigs. They're a better animal model. They actually get flu, and there's $175 million a year in flu shots for pigs. So work in an animal that actually gets the disease. Guatemala produces a lot of, a decent amount of global pork. So they have an industry there. And I had a collaboration with the University of San Carlos, and I was like, you know what, and there was extra property my father had he wasn't using. And so I contacted him, asked him about it. I'm like, I have this idea. I think it's going to involve some iterative cycles. That's the other problem with in vivo work is it doesn't work perfect the first time. You have to iterate. And if each one is a big animal study and it's going to take you a year and a half to get another grant to cycle through, you're talking about a decade of work to getting to something useful. And this was a solution around that where I could rapidly cycle iterations to be able to reach that objective. So we went down there. My brother is a construction worker, and so I had him go down while I was doing distributed bio and Stanford stuff, and he built out the facility according to spec. We hired in people to home manage it. We found a great veterinarian who worked in the swine flu outbreak down in Guatemala in 2009. And we had this collaboration with Erwin Calagua at University of San Carlos. And so I had that set up. And then I had this relationship with the University of San Francisco as well, where I had these biotechnology master students, which Sarah Ives came from that program. And I had a couple of them that came in and they loved it because I was like, look, I'm going to have you work on this crazy thing. It might not work, but it's involving flying to Guatemala a bunch. You're going to have to take blood. It's going to be flies everywhere. It's going to be a lot of work. You're going to have to process it in a lab. They're all like, yeah, hey, are you kidding me? You're going to take me to Lake Atilan? I'm in. And so that was basically how we set it up. And my feeling was I wanted to spend a little bit of money to throw the idea away so I could stop thinking about it if I was wrong. But that first experiment, it was a pain. Everything set up was a whole mess. I can go into that as much as you want, but it looked good. And so at that point, it was worth just doing the second iteration, and then the third iteration, and then the next thing we know, we won a Gates Foundation grant, and now the studies are being conducted here at laboratories in the United States in preparation for going to human trials.
I mean, to me, it's just it's one of those things where the innovative process to me is most interesting. And you kind of hit on it a little bit earlier in terms of the Netflix story in general. I've touched a lot on that in this podcast. That the number one thing that I think scientists in general could do is tell a story better, and just getting your story out there to me is one of the number one things that really helps, and sort of seeing the path that other people have walked also helps a little bit. I know I pair a lot of people together through my network. Whenever I know somebody that's done something in the past, and I know somebody right now that's getting ready to run a very expensive mouse study, and he's told me the amount of money that he plans on spending for that, which I think is just ungodly. But again, he's working on a large molecule drug, so it's it's one of those things. So I'm going to change gears with you a little bit in terms of COVID-19. So where do you think that we are right now in terms of kind of the future of vaccines and the speed of vaccines to market?
Interesting. Yeah, so I think the coronavirus pandemic was a referendum on, or a challenge to the state of biotechnology in some respects in its golden age. And I think what we've seen is every one of the technologies was pushed against the problem, and we've seen breakthroughs and examples of where technologies were very successful and where we still have problems. So on the good side, we've seen lots of technologies. We've fortunately seen this virus is susceptible to vaccination, and we've seen a breakthrough of these RNA vaccines that looked really good, which is great because that's an advancement for outside of the coronavirus and many other application areas, and other vaccines that also worked well here. That's the good news. The challenge we're seeing is that manufacturing. You constantly hear that we can't make enough vaccine. I think everyone's realizing the limitations of manufacture. And this is a unique problem because you're having to go manufacture enough doses for everybody on the planet, and maybe you have to do that on an annual basis, which is an unheard of expense and challenge. Just like how do you actually book enough of these bioreactors to actually go make enough of the material to go process? And what are the challenges? And everybody asks that, like, why can't you just build more factories? And that's where people are starting to learn. Like, it's amazing that like my niche field, suddenly it's dinner party conversation, right? Like, or I guess Zoom conversation, but people are like, so tell me a little bit more about this RNA purification. I was like, what? You're working finance. How do you know about this now? But everyone's aware of it. And I think that's, as I spoke to earlier, as part of the goals of Centivax, is this is what I've long seen as a major problem in the way of the supremacy of the capacity of biologic medicine to treat and create breakthroughs on diseases. But in between us and realizing that dream, we need to transform the manufacturing technologies. And so that's where there's been one big, I would say, it's not a failure because the drugs are being produced. I'm glad there's lots of companies making lots of vaccines, but we're not making enough. And so that's a weakness. I think the second area where I'm not real happy is, these vaccines are going to have the same problem as flu vaccines. We're seeing already that the South African, the Brazilian, the Japanese, these are the B1351 and derivative strains. Those ones are escaping these vaccines already, entirely in the case of the AZ vaccine and partially for the other vaccines. And that means that unfortunately it's only a matter of time before the virus continues to mutate enough that somewhere a fully escapable version pops up. So Moderna and Pfizer are already talking about making a new booster shot where they're adapting. And that means we're committed to the long haul of annual vaccination. That's obviously not great. That's why we've activated our broad spectrum vaccine program against the coronavirus. I didn't do it in 2020 because I was like, these other guys are going to hit it. It's not clear to me it's going to mutate it fast enough. If the world moves perfectly and well, we should be able to wipe this thing out before that's necessary. And as time's gone on, we have activated our program and I hope I don't need to use mine because it's going to be a while before we're even going into clinic. But we might need that if this thing is just stubbornly refusing to go away.
Whenever you look at like SARS and MERS, and I mean, even Ebola and the other Ebola or whatever, I mean, to me, it's almost like the continual mutation of these pandemics is just something that we're going to have to figure out how to live with, and how to create medicines for, and whether it's vaccines or antibodies. It seems to me like there's great technologies on both sides for us to continue to work with throughout time.
So here's where I'm going to be a little bit of an optimist. So, let me set this with to set everyone's expectations. The coronavirus is not going away by summer. It's basically endemic globally at this point. It's going to be incredibly difficult to actually eradicate it. I think you can have a community be vaccinated so there's low risk, and you have good medicines in hospitals or when you get sick so you don't have to go to the hospital. And that'll downgrade this from a global pandemic to a manageable infectious disease. But this thing's going to be around for years to come. Just be prepared for that. Now, that said, why would I be optimistic in such a case? So that's what I do. I focus on broad spectrum vaccines and broad spectrum antibodies. So here's why I'm able to be an optimist. I'm going to bring you into the wonderful world of molecular biology for a second. So all these viruses, they pop up and they're evolving, and that seems terrifying. But the silver lining is that we aren't really being infected with radically new viruses. We've seen the cousins before. So SARS-CoV-2 was a version of SARS-CoV-1, which was SARS. We've seen versions of that. It's been studied for years. Ebola, it pops up and it changes, the Marburg virus and so forth, but they're all a population of viruses we've seen before. So we don't have to confront an entirely new virus each time. And that's how I was able to go from the virus popping up. By the end of January, I started my program. By the end of March, I was done with antibody discovery. And I was able to do that so fast because I stood on the shoulder of giants who've been studying these things for 30 years. And that's the power of where we sit now. They do mutate constantly, but here's the really awesome Achilles heel, the weakness of these viruses. And that is that if I take you back in time to like 2000, everyone was like, we're never going to deal with flu because it mutates all the time. We'll never solve HIV. It was a rending, tearing of hair, and it was a hopeless skeptic and synaptic period. And then there were these amazing papers that came out where people started to say, hey, wait a second. Actually, sometimes in some people, someone like hits a genetic jackpot and they produce a broadly neutralizing antibody. They hit an antibody that doesn't hit just one strain of flu, but they seem like it neutralizes all of them.
It's that guy that never gets sick in the office. We know who that is.
Oh yeah, that guy. He's like, oh, I never take a vaccine. I'm sweet. It's the hippies. They're doing great. They're onto something. Like every once in a while, someone hits that jackpot and they have broad immunity because they hit this part of the virus that isn't able to change. And the virus, it wants to mutate everywhere, but imagine that part. If it changes that part, then the virus is no longer infectious. It has to leave that part alone. And so an antibody that blocks onto that part is able to go destabilize that whole family of viruses. And therefore, when those papers came out and they found them for flu, they found them for HIV, they found them for dengue, yes, they found them for the coronaviruses, it opened up the possibility of two things. One was the therapies. You can use those antibodies as a drug. And the second is it opened up the possibility of the whole concept of universal vaccines. Now, I prefer to call them broad spectrum because I think it's more medically accurate. There's going to be some crazy escape sometimes. But the idea was, well, if we can just get the body to make those antibodies, then we've solved the problem forever. And we can do the same thing we did with smallpox, which is get rid of these puppies for all time. And the power of where we are right now is we kind of know that that's possible. And everyone is on an arms race to try to go find that permanent solution, with us being one of the groups to accomplish that. The reason I'm optimistic about this is that our technologies are winning. I think other groups are showing some success. I'm very happy with what we've got. I think we have something pretty powerful here where we're teaching the immune system, which is kind of funny. If you think about it, you're like, well, wait a second. If that part's always there and it never changes, then why do we miss? Why does everybody get a flu shot, but most people don't? Why do they miss that spot? And there were a whole bunch of crazy theories. They were like bizarre, like ether theories from the 1800s about, the why our immune system was distracted from that site. And all these theories popped up because people didn't really understand the underlying mechanisms. And we think we have a handle on it, and our technology seems to be bearing that out because it's working. We're able to get the pigs, and we're working on ferrets, and we'll be going on humans next to provide a population of versions of the virus all at once so that the body learns to recognize the shared sites that are found all between them. And the B cells and the immune system that recognize the shared sites, they basically get a bigger dose compared to individual B cells that recognize a single strain. And therefore, the entire immune response is against those shared sites, and you're able to eliminate the virus forever. And so for that reason, I think we actually, I know it's hard to say this in the depressing period of a pandemic where it seems like we're down in the bottom of the fifth, like we're getting beat down with this guy, but we're going to punch back. We're going to go knock down the coronavirus. And I think hopefully this is a enzymatic stimulus to global science for us to invest in and create these permanent victories. So broad spectrum vaccines, broad spectrum antibodies, and push these viruses back out of the human condition. And we've done it before. In 1980, the World Health Organization was able to announce the end of smallpox forever. We've nearly eradicated a number of other pathogens, the ones that didn't mutate as fast. We just need a new generation of technology to wipe out the ones that are left over. And sometimes it's hard to feel that you can see that future when we're living in the middle of a pandemic, certainly, but if you look throughout the arc of history, humans have consistently overcome challenges in front of them, and technology mediates that accomplishment. And nowhere has any generation ever been armed as well as we are to be able to win these kinds of wars. So that I'm actually an optimist, and I think within the next 40 years, constant infection is going to be largely an experience of the past in certain isolated communities. And if I think of humanity in the next 200 or 300 years, I imagine us living in a largely pathogen-free experience.
I look forward to being able to look back on this and just think about all of the phenomenal things that happened in this time period. You're right; it is a bit hard at the moment, but at the same time, I feel a little bit more optimistic now with some of the vaccines being administered,
Yeah.
and the broader portions of populations getting doses today. So there are 3 questions that I like to ask every guest. What inspires you?
A lot of things. I think I'll tell you a couple. One is my grandfather. So most of my family are innkeepers and artists. My grandfather was the other scientist. So he is Stanley Van Gunn. He worked with NASA and Rocketdyne, was leading the program for developing the F2 and F1 and the J2 engines. Those are the core engines that took the manned moon missions up. He worked with Operation Paperclip and Von Braun. And he was a remarkable character, just absolutely brilliant and practical, and just a humanitarian. And he came from what I kind of sometimes feels like I'm almost like a nobler age in science, or maybe it was just him. But I have a painting of him here in my room, and he I guess physically as well as metaphorically sits behind me when I work. And I think throughout my whole life, having him and the template that he created has made it not so scary for me to imagine big change. It's the same kind of inspiration I get when I go across the Golden Gate Bridge. I think it's easy to fall into the frustration of daily politics or, the dramas of the human condition. And certainly we as a population of arguing animals are susceptible to those things. But you look up and you see the moon, you realize we've been there. And I go across the Golden Gate Bridge and I realize this magnificent thing so much larger than us that we've created tells us that humanity can accomplish absolutely great things. And it's okay to imagine that world that doesn't exist yet. But if you can imagine it well enough and plot a path, it's inevitable that such a world can be created. And I think that inspires me because I feel the strength of being able to look to a greater future and that believe that we can do it. And then humans are ultimately more creative and good. And there's a truth in progress in science and math and indeed the human philosophical condition that over the march of time, we may suffer, we may falter, but the world ahead of us can be better and we can create that. And those things inspire me. They make me feel excited to get up to work every day and happy to work with the people around me, and that my work's going to matter, that I can go work in my hands on my lifetime. And at the end of it, and hopefully beyond, we can all look back and be like, that was time well spent, that we created something permanently better than where we started. And that is something that will always keep me happy.
Phenomenal inspiration. What concerns you?
Lots of things concern me. I am concerned by, there are deep inequities on medical science around the world. There's deep problems with pathogens, and frankly, it's just going to get worse because we're more and more people on this planet, and we travel faster and easier than we ever have before. There's going to be more competition over resources. Those things all concern me. I feel that I'm not solving all the problems by going after medicine. I think there's other areas like energy and other areas need to be addressed. I think there need to be better economic systems and better political arrangements between the many nation states to avoid the risk of war. But medicine can help. Just like the microcosm of the village where I grew up, I came back every year. And as I came back, I noticed the kids were getting much taller than their parents and their grandparents. And it's because they started handing out deworming medicine in the schools. And that just was just outrageous. If it told you that everyone was living under this constant burden of pathogen that was limiting their health and their life and their growth capacity, and then handing out a simple medicine could change that. And those people were healthier and they were spending less time sick, which was more time doing other things. They probably were doing better in school. And that basically just told me that what was true in Santiago, Atitlan, should be true for the whole world. That if we can go eliminate the constant parasite of disease on the economic and personal capacity for growth, then we would be fighting less over the scraps that are left, and we'd have more time to create new things, and more people would be imagining that better future and building towards it. And so that's what I like. What I'm worried about is the inequality, and how do you create practical systems to change? You have to create a good business model working systems, they need to be driven by economics. It's hard to push non-economic work uphill. So you need to make that an inevitability that the world has access to better resources. Those are the things that worry me. I worry about all the technology steps to get there.
Yeah, for sure. And what excites you?
I like building new stuff. It's fun. We launched a company at the beginning of this year. We're going to go phase 1 clinical in June 1st. We're conversations around going IPO are happening. Like this is an exciting launch to an idea that I've been cooking since 2008, and I love building new things. I think I also just hate it when I feel like there's loose ends that aren't being done. So I want to just kill a project, or I want to see it all the way to finish. And I'm willing to kill it if it's not good, but what I hate is the idea of something awesome that didn't manifest. That drives me nuts. And I think that frustration and that sense of irritation, as well as combined with the excitement of success, I think is one of my drivers and what excites me the most, because it's so fulfilling to watch the things you build come to life. And I think I'm very excited about that. I'm excited about honestly, I'm like a kid in a candy shop right now. We have this like amazing ability to sequence the genome and do high throughput sequence, high throughput synthesis, high throughput function. There's so many new amazing technologies bubbling up that it's a challenge to even keep an eye on all of them. And so my goal is, given my background of like math and computer science and biostatistics and immunology and bioengineering and entrepreneurial background, which I've cultivated on purpose, is my hope is that collection of different backgrounds gives me the ability to perform synapses between different discrete technologies and identify ways of combining and identifying a unique breakthrough, killer app for these technologies as they come online. And that means I'm never going to get bored. I'm going to be entertained with what I do until the day I die, and that's exciting to me, and so is the work.
Isn't that something that we all want? So back to your point about the organizational growth, I know I followed Centivax a little while ago, and I keep seeing all of your organization announcements pop up on LinkedIn. I've been following your publications, for a while, and I see more and more people, it seems like every day, citing stuff that you've written before. So with all of that, Jacob Glanville, I just wanted to thank you for being on the podcast today. Thanks a lot for spending time with me and answering all my questions. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me on. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers.